It's not uncommon for newly founded countries to plan and develop a capital city from the ground up. Think of Washington, D.C. or Canberra, relatively recent cities conceived with rational urban planning principles in mind. Governments have plenty of good reasons to build a new capital, even if perfectly viable cities already exist. For example, they may want to create a new seat of political power, geographically and symbolically removed from already established centers of influence. Or they may wish to stimulate economic and demographic growth in underdeveloped areas. Finally, they may want to make the best use of their country's top talent in architecture and planning, a talent that might seize the occasion to enact their vision for a perfect urban landscape, a monumental utopia on Earth. The latter two intentions have been best realized by Brasilia, Brazil's capital city, inaugurated in April 1960. It has been hailed, and rightfully so, as a majestic, masterful monument to human progress conceived according to the precepts of modernist architecture. The story of its development has been celebrated as a success story, an epic of brilliant insight and indefatigable labor, culminating in a visionary yet tangible utopia, a blueprint for the city of the future. And yet, as we'll discover, the history of Brasilia has its dark corners. What might appear as an architectural dream to some may materialize as an urban dystopia to others. Brasilia is the federal capital of Brazil, located in the federal district within Goiás state on the country's central plateau. The city lies some 1,200 kilometers north of Rio de Janeiro at an elevation of approximately 1,100 meters above sea level. It covers a surface area of 5,800 square kilometers and houses a population of 2.8 million across its metro area. Now, based on these numbers alone, Brasilia is far from being an impressively large capital city. What makes it distinctive is that it was planned entirely from scratch in the late 1950s, according to the revolutionary concepts of modernist architecture. But what makes Brasilia truly impressive is that it was built in just over 4 years, from November 1956 to April 1960. In a way, its planners and architects treated the Central Plateau as a giant canvas, creating a vast utopian work of art designed to be enjoyed on the ground as well as admired from the skies. This unique urbanistic vision earned Brasilia the accolade of UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987. As much as its development was accelerated over just a few years, ideas for a brand new capital have been knocking around for a much longer time. The first capital of Brazil, when it was still a Portuguese colonial possession, was Salvador de Bahia, founded in 1549. Rio de Janeiro became the capital in 1763 and remained so after independence was declared on September 7th, 1822. One of the heroes of the independence struggle was Joaquim José de Silva Xavier, known as Tiradentes, leader of the Inconferencia Mineira separatist movement. Now, back in 1789, Tiradentes had laid out plans to establish a new capital for an independent Brazil to be located in the Minas Gerais province. However, his ambitious plans were irreversibly crushed on April 21st, 1792, when Portuguese authorities had him hanged and then quartered. The past, everybody. Now, this is the type of treatment that will make you a national hero, yes, but it's not exactly conducive to ambitious urban planning, is it? Now, after Brazil became independent under Emperor Pedro I, his Secretary of State, José Bonifácio de Andrada Silva, proposed building a new capital city in the country's interior. At the time, most of the population and economic activities were disproportionately concentrated on the southeastern coast, and Bonifácio's idea was to redress the imbalance by building the new center further to the northwest. He even came up with a neat name for the new development, Brasilia. Guess it stuck. His plans were formalized in a bill in 1827, but the bill never became law, as Emperor Pedro dissolved the Legislative Assembly and exiled Bonifácio. So, coming up with ideas for a new capital seemed to provoke exile at best or brutal execution at worst, but the dream was not dead yet. Brazil became a republic in 1889, and in 1891, its constitution formally mentions the idea of founding a new capital further inland. In 1892, the government even surveyed the Central Plateau, identifying the perfect location for the future capital and the surrounding federal district. The Brazilian Assembly ratified further laws in 1922, 1934, and 1946, all confirming that yes, indeed, we do need to shift the political center of the country away from Rio de Janeiro. But the big move did not take place until the right man for the job came along: President Juscelino Kubitschek. Also known as JK, the Social Democratic candidate entered office in January 1956, riding on the slogan, 50 years of progress in 5. Sounds almost Stalinistic, doesn't it? But clearly, JK intended to launch a fast-paced program of infrastructural and economic development. At its center was the plan to finally give Brazil its long-awaited new capital city. The new president did not waste time, setting an ambitious deadline for the inauguration of what would be Brasilia, April the 21st, Tiradentes Day, in 1960. The federal government issued a competition open to architects and urban planners to select the best project for the new capital. A panel of judges led by British planner William Halford reviewed more than 20 submissions, including one consisting of barely 15 freehand sketches and 23 handwritten paragraphs. But this entry, it managed to impress the judges as it laid out plans for a well-organized city neatly divided into business and residential areas, well served by a network of fast-flowing highways. Besides, this proposal came from a national celebrity in urban planning, one who had been influenced by and worked with the superstar of modernist architecture, Le Corbusier. The winning architect was Lucio Marçal Ferreira Ribeiro Lima Costa, and because there's a really long name, he was known as Lucio Costa. Now, Costa clearly embraced the no-wasting-time spirit and quickly assembled his dream team of top talent. Landscape designer Roberto Buil-Marx, responsible for the parks and communal areas, and fellow modernist architect Oscar Niemeyer, in charge of designing the major landmarks and model residential buildings. Niemeyer himself defined his aesthetics as such. I am not attracted to straight angles or to the straight line, hard and inflexible, created by man. I am attracted to free-flowing, sensual curves, the curves that I find in the mountains of my country, in the sinuousness of its rivers, in the waves of the ocean, and on the body of the beloved woman. Fittingly, Lucio Costa combined sensual curves with more rational straight lines in his grand plan for Brasilia, which he dubbed Plano Piloto, or the Pilot Plan. And even I knew that. Now, we will describe it in more detail in a later section, but the Plano Piloto laid out the urban center along two main axes intersecting at the Estaca Zero, or Square One. One axis was roughly orientated from west to east, and that would be the monumental axis, housing government, administrative, religious, and public buildings. The other axis, laid out from north to south, would be curved with its convex side facing eastward. This would be the thoroughfare axis, subdivided into superquadras or superblocks of apartment buildings where most residents would live. These superblocks were to be arranged along 4 parallel strips, flanked by areas occupied by communal services such as schools and hospitals. Further to the east of the curved axis, Costa intended to excavate a large artificial lake, Lago Paranoia, conceived to mitigate the dryness and aridity of the Central Plateau's climate. Beyond the lake, he planned another district of single-family houses, providing more accommodation for government employees and public officials. All in all, when viewed from above, Brasilia would appear as a giant bird soaring over the Central Plateau, flying towards the coast. Even better, as a giant jet plane, with the main government building clearly located where the cockpit would be, symbolizing their function in leading Brazil toward its future. The construction of Brasilia was overseen and executed on the grounds by a new government agency, the Urbanizing Company for the New Capital, or NovaCap for short. Now, NovaCap recruited thousands of construction workers, mostly from the north of the country, who would be known as candangos. On November 3rd, 1956, the first 250 candangos reached the construction site to be housed in a makeshift camp of tents dubbed Lonalandia, which translates as tarpaulin land. The rickety tents were gradually replaced by wooden houses, and Lonlandia was renamed Villa dos Candangos, or the City of the Builders, which mushroomed organically next to the rigorously planned outline of Brasilia. Retail and recreational establishments were forbidden in Villa dos Candangos, and thus yet another city sprouted close to the construction site, first named Free City and later Pioneer Center. It featured shops, movie theaters, bars, even a red light district. Throughout 1957 and 1958, Pioneer Center also functioned as a welcome hub for new candangos, more workers seeking employment after a drought had stricken Brazil's northeast. Total estimates of builders working to erect Brasilia range from 40,000 and 120,000. According to a May 1959 census, the workforce had been increasing by an average of 2,100 laborers every single month. The original Villa dos Candangos, or Workers' Town, was not enough to house them all, and more precarious dwellings sprouted around the building site, which were nicknamed the Invasions. Every day, the workers would file out of the invasions and break their backs in grueling 18-hour shifts to meet the ambitious deadline set by President JK. According to Professor Nair Bicalo of the University of Brasilia, most workers were subjected to less than ideal conditions by their employers, building contractors such as the Pacheco Fernandes Construction Company. Much like other contractors, Fernandes had set up a canteen for their laborers. But, like other canteens, it was always crowded with endless lines of hungry workers awaiting for meals that often consisted of spoiled food. On February 8, 1959, two builders complained about the Fernandes canteen service, sparking an incident described either as a loud commotion or a full-on revolt. This caused the intervention of the Brasilia Special Guard, a special police force constituted to maintain order in the Pioneer Center and Workers' Town. Two officers arrived on the scene, but they were surrounded by the angry workers and wisely fled. What happened next is widely disputed to this day. According to Ernesto Silva, a former director of Novacap, the urbanizing company in charge, the mutinous workers looted the accommodation facilities. The Special Guard intervened in force and, quote, "There was just one person killed in the fray." One too many, one might argue. Now, Professor Nair Bicalo reconstructed another version of events based on the statements of more than 30 witnesses, including a police colonel. The night following the riot in the canteen, a platoon of Special Guard officers surrounded the workers' barracks and then, quote, "The police shot the workers while they were sleeping. I obtained statements about dozens of workers who were hit. A total of 120 suitcases were never collected from the accommodation." Witnesses told Professor Bicalo that dozens of dead bodies were collected by a truck and taken away to an unknown location. The number of abandoned suitcases suggests an unconfirmed death toll of up to 120. Again, according to Professor Bicalo, the entire incident was scarcely reported and quickly forgotten due to government intervention. Quoting him again, "Part of the political class resisted the idea of moving the country's capital, and a massacre like this, if it came to light, would bring serious political damage to the president's plans." The ambitious presidential plans for Brasilia were threatened by another factor: lack of funds. As early as 1957, the New York Times argued that, quoting, "Even if the controversial Brasilia concept is basically sound, the government is spending more money in its headlong rush to build the capital in 4 years than Brazil's inflated and deficit-ridden economy can afford." Indeed, to finance this project, JK's government had resorted to printing money, which quickly, obviously, led to inflation. According to authors James N. Green and Thomas E. Skidmore in their work Brazil, 5 Centuries of Change, the overspending on Brasilia plunged the nation into economic and political instability, accelerating the process that led to the military coup of March 31st, 1964. In their words, eventually, the nation's uncertainty resulted in a military coup that transformed Brasilia from a symbolic bastion of popular democracy to a physical manifestation of tragic irony, at the same time furthering inequality throughout the country and discrediting the Brazilian government's international legitimacy. Brazil's coup and subsequent 21-year-long military dictatorship would deserve a video all its own, so let's stick with Brasilia today. Urban planning, architecture, more we do on this channel. Now, despite the challenges we've described, Novacap and the heroic Candangos met their deadline, and Brazil's brand new capital city was inaugurated on April 21st, 1960, boasting elegant, futuristic-looking landmarks and an initial population of 50,000 civil servants and 60,000 migrant workers. In the words of Dr. Stefan Lehman of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas School of Architecture, quote, "At this time, Brasilia was seen as a modern utopia that expressed optimism and trust in the future." As mentioned earlier, this modern utopia had been laid out by its creator, Costa, along 2 main axes. In his vision, these 2 urban backbones would serve to harmonize the 4 main elements, or scales, that composed the ideal city: the monumental, the bucolic, the social, and the residential. The monumental scale encompasses the public buildings designed by Oscar Niemeyer, standing tall along the east-to-west axis. Notable landmarks include the National Congress, one of Brasilia's most photographed buildings, consisting of a flat structure flanked by twin towers housing the Federal Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. Another distinctive creation is the Cathedral Metropolitana Nossa Senhora Aparecida, a circular structure held by 16 arched pillars resembling a thorny crown. The cathedral is perhaps Niemeyer's most celebrated work, alongside Palacio Itamarati, framed by a stunning reflecting pool. And finally, there is Palacio de Alvorada, the official residence of the President of Brazil, set against the backdrop of Lake Paranoa and organically integrating with its natural surroundings. In fact, most of Niemar's creations are framed by or set against one of the gardens, lawns, or pools designed by landscape architect Roberto Burle Marx. This was part of Costa's intention to permeate all aspects of life in Brasilia with a bucolic state and provide the capital with a unique city park look. The social scale of Brasilia is fueled by its central section, where the monumental and thoroughfare axes intersect and where banks, hotels, businesses, and other services are concentrated. And that leads us to the residential scale. As mentioned, most housing structures are distributed along the curved thoroughfare axis, itself divided into the north and south wings. These wings are further subdivided into a total of 108 superquadras or superblocks, each measuring 300 by 300 meters. The perimeters of these blocks are lined with large apartment buildings up to 7 stories high and supported by large pylons or stilts. The center of each quadra consists of a landscaped pedestrian courtyard which extends beneath the stilt-supported buildings, thus connecting each superblock to the next. Each home in these neighborhood units is no more than 800 meters away from a primary school or other local facilities which can be reached via safe footpaths, allowing for a clear separation between pedestrians and vehicles. Lucio Costa was clearly very proud of his superblock concept, itself inspired by his mentor, Le Corbusier. As Costa later declared, quote, "I believe there was wisdom in the conception. All the buildings detached from the ground on stilts, in the average size of European cities' traditional buildings, before the elevator, harmonious, human, everything related to everyday life, children playing freely within reach of mother's call." Now, the superblocks, however, were and are not self-contained habitation centers. Their residents could access a limited number of neighborhood services on foot, but Brasilia as a whole was planned as a city in which different zones fulfilled different functions. Hence, places of work, shopping areas, and most services were located far away from residential areas. This meant that inhabitants were expected by design to cover long distances by car or bus every day, multiple times a day. This expectation is reflected in Costa's approach to Brasilia's road network, which manages to be highly efficient and rarely congested with barely any use of traffic lights. The development of superquadras encountered a roadblock in 1964 as a new housing model emerged in Brazil. By that time, the military dictatorship under Marshal Humberto de Alencar Castelo Branco enjoyed financial assistance from the US Agency for International Development, and part of their contributions flowed into a newly founded National Housing Bank, or NHB. According to architect Thomas Deckler of King's College London, the NHB favoured investments in individual, isolated houses for low-income families, which was the exact opposite of Lucio Costa's vision. Hence, NHB funding poured away from Brasilia and into the expansion of 27 nearby satellite towns. In the ensuing decades, as the satellite towns expanded, work resumed in the thoroughfare axis of Brasilia, but to maximize the profitability of the real estate, developers disregarded Costa's concept of maintaining balance between the residential, social, and bucolic scales. New building practices favored the residential scale only, leading to increased housing density, which in Decker's words, quote, destroyed the relationship between interior space and public realm, which is so apparent in the original superquadras, and a managed and communal public realm effectively ceased to exist. Increased supply of housing in Brasilia did not imply a fall in prices, though. In fact, the opposite happened toward the end of the 1960s when the government put the apartments in the superblocks up for sale. These were naturally grabbed by mid to high-level civil servants, which marginalized lower-income families further and further towards the periphery of the satellite towns. As described by Architectural Digest, quote, those satellite towns, akin to Brazil's favelas, were not intended to be part of Costa's final concept, but they developed organically to hold the Plano Pilato's overflow, and today they highlight the socioeconomic disparity that troubles many major cities around the world, and especially those in Brazil. In fact, only about 12% of the residents of Brasilia's metropolitan area actually live in the thoroughfare axis or the slightly outer districts by Lake Paranoa. The vast majority inhabit the satellite areas, with 800,000 of them commuting via bus every day. When Brazil emerged from military rule in 1985, the new government, led by President José Sarney, attempted to re-centralize Brasilia's population by initiating another wave of development along the thoroughfare axis. The idea was to develop a new set of apartment buildings within the existing superquadras, a plan that carried the risk of uncontrolled and unplanned urban expansion. The scheme was laid to rest in 1987 when the capital city was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The main criterion for this listing was, quote, Brasilia is a singular artistic achievement, a prime creation of the human genius, representing, on an urban scale, the living expression of the principles and ideals advanced by the modernist movement and effectively embodied in the tropics through the urban and architectural planning of Lúcio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer. Accordingly, as a protected heritage site, no further unchecked large-scale construction could take place. Moreover, the UNESCO accolade was certainly a source of pride for the city and the country as a whole, as well as being a boon for tourism. On the other hand, critics believe that this designation effectively froze Brasilia in time, preventing it from evolving to its full potential. And you may have picked up by now that Lúcio Costa's grand planned city was not everybody's cup of tea, to put it mildly. According to Brian Carter at the University of Buffalo, Brasilia represents a betrayal of what the modernist movement stood for: egalitarianism. In his view, Costa's pilot plan was more of a nod to classicist or neoclassicist concepts, in which grandiose government buildings and monuments stood apart from ordinary citizens, symbolizing a stark separation between those in power and their subjects. Alejandra Quintana of the University of Texas focuses on the residential scale instead, arguing that the apartment blocks in the superquadras were too similar to each other and thus did not become a source of identity. Instead of forging collective associations, Brasilia's superquadras served to isolate and normalize residents. Miami-based architect Kobe Karp, among others, highlighted one of Brasilia's most visible flaws: its over-reliance on long, wide streets and highways which can be traversed only by car or bus. This structural concept effectively prevented its inhabitants from enjoying the perks of lively neighborhood life typical of Brazil's coastal cities. In very simple terms, critics argue that in Brasilia, it is not possible to just take a stroll to the corner shop, engage in chit-chat with a passerby, or improvise a game of football at the park. In broader terms, it could be argued that Brasilia's social life is confined to formal, interior spaces which curb the most vibrant aspects of a city's fabric: unexpected encounters, celebrations, discussions, even protests. This is best summarized by Ricky Burdett, professor of urban studies at the London School of Economics. We'll quote him here. "The problem is that it's not a city. It's that simple. The issue is not whether it's a good city or a bad city, it's just not a city. It doesn't have the ingredients of a city: messy streets, people living above shops, and offices nearby." In summary, Brasilia appears to embody some of the worst aspects of dystopian sci-fi in an urban setting: alienation, social isolation, overwhelming and dehumanizing architecture, preponderance of motorized transport, and extreme economic disparity reflected in the very geography of the place. But Brasilia also has its admirers, obviously. That pervasive, car-friendly system of highways has actually been lauded as a masterpiece of sustainable urban mobility, as it prevents frequent congestion and is traversed by a well-organized public transportation system. As for the superquadras, not all of them are antiseptic, cookie-cutter dwellings devoid of amenities. Many superblocks have, in fact, evolved from their initial neutral state into thriving communities where young families can access local shops, restaurants, and cafes while enjoying informal get-togethers in the lush courtyards. In recent years, the Brasilia metropolitan area has been undergoing several initiatives to improve its livability, including plans to reduce car over-reliance by developing more bicycle paths and increasing bus lanes. Of course, much more will need to be done in order to fulfill Lúcio Costa's vision, where the monumental, bucolic, social, and residential scales are seamlessly integrated. Perhaps it's just a matter of time. I mean, after all, Brasilia is only 65 years old this April. To quote again from Professor Burdett, "Most of the places that we all adore, all of them, from Cairo to London, took either 5,000 or 6,000 years to get there. Let's not be unkind. Let's wait another 200 years and then talk about it." Thank you for watching.